Tonight, we uncover a truth so hidden, so carefully buried, that the Vatican didn't simply lock it away. They hid it in shadows, encoded in texts few have ever seen. Names whispered in fear, demons feared by the faithful, traced not to folklore or imagination, but to ancient beings recorded in the earliest human civilizations. The Igigi, celestial watchers of Mesopotamia, whose names were twisted, translated, and transformed over millennia into the demons we know today. Every syllable, every utterance carries a story the Church has kept secret, a knowledge that challenges the origins of faith, the power of words, and the authority of those who claim to speak for God. Those who tried to trace these names in forbidden manuscripts faced locked archives, cloistered scholars, and a silence so absolute it erased centuries of history. And those who revealed too much, their discoveries vanished into obscurity, never to be spoken of again. So before you dare descend into this hidden world, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Long before the temples of Rome pierced the sky, and long before the story of Christ shaped the hearts of millions, there existed another order of beings known as the Igigi. The Igigi appear repeatedly in Sumerian texts as divine servants of the Anunnaki, a higher pantheon of gods worshipped in the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, particularly in the 3rd millennium before Christ. Their name translates roughly to those who watch or those who toil in the heavens, suggesting a dual role as overseers and workers of cosmic tasks. Unlike the Anunnaki, whose stories were carefully preserved, the Igigi were gradually erased from collective memory, leaving behind only fragments in clay tablets and inscriptions hidden deep in museum archives. Archaeologists first encountered their presence when excavating the ruins of Uruk, Ur, and Nippur in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These tablets describe the Igigi performing laborious tasks in the heavens, maintaining rivers, skies, and celestial order for the Anunnaki, and at times descending to Earth to instruct early humans in arts, astronomy, and agriculture. The precise relationship between the Igigi and humans remains a subject of scholarly debate, but the texts suggest they were intermediaries, bridging divine wisdom and mortal understanding. Many scholars note that references to the Igigi closely parallel passages in the apocryphal Book of Enoch, written centuries later, which tells of the Watchers, angels sent to earth, who imparted forbidden knowledge to mankind. This connection raises the question of how much of early Mesopotamian myth was preserved indirectly through later religious texts, and why the Church later suppressed books like Enoch, labeling them apocryphal. The Vatican has long maintained archives containing documents and translations of cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, some of which were never made public, suggesting a sustained interest in the Igigi and their role in human history. From a historical perspective, the Igigi are as real as the scribes who recorded them and the cities where they were worshipped. They existed within a framework of sophisticated astronomy, agriculture, and urban planning that characterized Sumerian civilization between 4,000 and 2,000 years before Christ. The erasure of the Igigi from modern awareness was not a natural fading, but a result of centuries of selective preservation, where only certain texts were copied, translated, and circulated. The consequences of this erasure are profound because they reshape how we view the origins of human civilization, the transmission of knowledge, and the intersection between myth and historical fact. Understanding the Igigi offers a glimpse into a world where gods were not merely figures of worship, but active participants in the development of human culture. Their story, hidden within clay tablets, the margins of academic translations, and the secret vaults of religious institutions, challenges the neat narratives handed down through time. By examining the historical records and cross-referencing archaeological evidence with surviving Sumerian texts, it becomes clear that the Igigi were not myths created for entertainment or moral instruction. They were part of a complex system of divine hierarchy and earthly influence that has been obscured and perhaps intentionally hidden by those who controlled the written word. The whisper of the Igigi reminds us that history is never complete, and that some truths lie in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered by those who dare to question what has been lost or deliberately concealed. The Igigi are consistently mentioned in Sumerian and Akkadian texts as subordinate deities working under the Anunnaki, the primary gods of Mesopotamia. Their name suggests watchers or overseers, reflecting a role in maintaining cosmic and earthly order, often performing tasks too burdensome for the higher gods themselves. Historical sources from the 3rd millennium before Christ describe the Igigi as tending the heavens, regulating rivers, and ensuring the fertility of lands below. In certain texts, they descend to the earth to interact with humans, offering knowledge of agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and the arts, effectively serving as teachers of early civilization. Scholars have long debated whether the myths about the Igigi are purely symbolic, or if they preserve memories of actual events or beings from a pre-biblical reality. Excavations at sites like Nippur, and Lagash uncovered clay tablets detailing these hierarchies and duties. But many of the most significant tablets were transported to Europe during the 19th century and have been housed in collections that were not fully accessible to the public for decades. The Book of Enoch, a Jewish text composed around 200 years before the Common Era, describes the Watchers, angels sent to earth to impart forbidden knowledge, a narrative strikingly similar to the Sumerian depiction of the Igigi. This has led researchers to consider that stories of divine intermediaries might have been preserved across cultures and centuries, transformed to align with emerging religious doctrines. The Vatican, through its long history of collecting rare texts and manuscripts, has reportedly held translations of cuneiform documents that reference the Igigi, suggesting a continuing interest in their origin and role. Historically, the Sumerians understood the heavens with surprising precision, mapping stars, planets, and celestial movements, and these astronomical observations are often linked to the Igigi in texts, implying they may have guided early human understanding of the cosmos. By examining the surviving artifacts, such as the Eridu Genesis and other Sumerian creation tablets, historians notice a pattern where the Igigi are associated with both cosmic labor and the oversight of human progress, establishing a clear chain of authority from the Anunnaki down to mankind. The apparent erasure of the Igigi from later traditions might be attributed to the rise of monotheistic religions that sought to reinterpret polytheistic hierarchies in a framework suitable for emerging doctrines. Archaeological evidence, combined with comparative mythology, suggests that the Igigi could represent a bridge between human and divine knowledge, an intermediary class of beings whose memory was gradually suppressed. Their disappearance from mainstream historical consciousness illustrates the ways in which institutions can shape collective memory, determining which stories endure and which fade. The study of the Igigi not only illuminates Mesopotamian culture, but also forces a reconsideration of what might have been lost in the transmission of pre-biblical knowledge. Understanding them requires attention to the clay tablets, ancient inscriptions, and later texts that echo their presence, revealing a pattern of oversight, guidance, and interaction with humanity that challenges the neat separation between myth and history. The Igigi serve as a reminder that what we call myth often contains fragments of forgotten history, and that our understanding of early civilizations may still be incomplete, shaped by both what was preserved and what was intentionally hidden. Excavations in the ancient cities of Sumer, including Ur, Uruk, and Nippur, uncovered thousands of cuneiform tablets dating back to the 3rd millennium before Christ. Many of these tablets reference the Igigi, describing their roles as celestial overseers and laborers for the Anunnaki. Yet most of these details have been quietly obscured in modern translations. The tablets often record the Igigi's responsibilities in maintaining the heavens, regulating water flows, and instructing humans in basic arts and sciences, evidence of a sophisticated understanding of the natural world by the Sumerians. Despite their historical significance, the majority of translations during the 19th and early 20th centuries were filtered through academic and ecclesiastical institutions, often omitting references that conflicted with dominant religious narratives. The Vatican, along with other European scholarly organizations, acquired numerous tablets during this period, controlling access and ensuring that certain texts were either unpublished or only partially interpreted. This selective preservation has led some researchers to argue that the suppression of Igigi references was intentional, motivated by a desire to prevent the integration of pre-biblical knowledge into mainstream thought. Certain manuscripts, particularly those describing interactions between the Igigi and humans, were considered too controversial, because they suggested the existence of beings that imparted advanced knowledge long before the biblical account of creation. Historical records indicate that cuneiform tablets were meticulously copied by scribes in Mesopotamia. Yet, when these texts entered European hands, the copying process often involved translation into Latin or modern European languages, introducing editorial decisions that emphasized religious orthodoxy over historical accuracy. Some tablets were housed in private collections and the Vatican archives, inaccessible to the wider scholarly community, while others were archived in museums with restrictions on study and reproduction. The consequences of these actions were profound, because they limited the ability of historians and archaeologists to fully understand the scope of Sumerian civilization and the role of the Igigi within it. Archaeologists have noted that surviving translations often sanitize or simplify the descriptions of celestial beings and their involvement in human affairs, effectively erasing critical details that might challenge established religious and historical narratives. The pattern of control over these texts mirrors broader strategies seen in the preservation and suppression of knowledge throughout history, where institutions determine which histories are recorded and which are hidden. By examining the original tablets and cross-referencing multiple sources, modern researchers are beginning to recover the fuller picture of the Igigi, their influence on early human civilization, and their continued presence in myth and legend. The careful study of these artifacts reveals that the Igigi weren't merely symbolic figures, but part of a complex system of divine administration with tangible impact on human development. The suppression and redirection of these texts highlight the power of gatekeeping in shaping collective memory, and remind us that what is absent from historical records can be as revealing as what is present. The tablets, the church, and other institutions never wanted widely known contain layers of knowledge that challenge the conventional understanding of pre-biblical history, suggesting a world where divine oversight and human advancement were intertwined in ways that have only recently begun to be appreciated. Ancient Sumerian texts repeatedly describe the Igigi as descending from the heavens to interact directly with humans, performing roles that went beyond simple oversight and into instruction and influence. These celestial beings are portrayed as intermediaries between the Anunnaki and mankind, teaching early societies about agriculture, metalworking, astronomy, and law. The Enuma Elish and other creation tablets make indirect references to these beings, suggesting their presence in the foundation of human civilization between 4,000 and 2,000 years before Christ. This narrative finds an intriguing parallel in the Book of Enoch, written around 200 years before the Common Era, which describes the Watchers, angels who descended to earth and intermarried with humans, imparting forbidden knowledge that shaped early society. Scholars note that these texts share consistent themes of divine beings crossing into the human realm, the transference of advanced knowledge, and the consequences of breaking divine boundaries. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia, including inscriptions and cylinder seals, depicts winged figures or beings associated with celestial authority, reinforcing the textual claims of heavenly visitation. The Igigi, in particular, are often mentioned as laborers in the skies who eventually became involved in human affairs, an interaction that may have been perceived as transgressive by later religious authorities. The potential connections between these accounts and the biblical narrative have long fascinated historians and theologians, raising questions about how much of early Mesopotamian belief influenced later Judeo-Christian texts. Textual analysis indicates that Sumerian scribes documented these interactions with great care, sometimes embedding warnings about the consequences of human-divine contact, suggesting an awareness of the extraordinary nature of these unions. The Vatican, which has collected and maintained translations of ancient Mesopotamian texts for centuries, has shown particular interest in manuscripts detailing the Igigi and similar beings, with evidence that some documents were withheld or carefully curated to prevent widespread dissemination. These hidden records contain references to celestial beings teaching humans sophisticated knowledge that in later centuries could have conflicted with religious doctrine or the monopoly on understanding the divine. By comparing the Sumerian tablets with other ancient sources, historians see a pattern in which the Igigi acted as cultural intermediaries, shaping early human development while remaining a separate class of divine entities. The parallels with the Watchers in the Book of Enoch suggest that these ideas persisted across cultures and time, transmitted through oral traditions, codices, and preserved tablets. The descent of the Igigi into human society reflects a recurring theme of heavenly beings influencing earthbound civilizations, a theme carefully controlled or reinterpreted by later institutions. Understanding these interactions requires examining the tablets in their original context, noting the roles assigned to the Igigi, and recognizing the historical and religious significance of their actions. These accounts challenge conventional interpretations of mythology and early history, implying that early humans received guidance from beings of advanced knowledge and authority. the descent of the Igigi, their forbidden unions with humans, and their instruction in complex skills form a consistent historical record across multiple sources, highlighting a period in human history where the lines between the divine and mortal were intentionally blurred. These records, preserved through clay tablets and cryptic inscriptions, offer a window into a time when knowledge was gifted from the heavens and remind us that much of what was recorded has been hidden or forgotten over millennia, shaping the way civilizations would remember and reinterpret their own origins. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as European archaeologists excavated the ruins of Ur, Uruk, and Nippur, many of the most significant discoveries of cuneiform tablets were funded or supported by church-affiliated institutions. The Vatican, despite its public stance condemning Mesopotamian religions as pagan, demonstrated a keen interest in acquiring and preserving these ancient records, particularly those referencing the Igigi. Historical records indicate that teams of scholars and clerics were sent to the Middle East to study, translate, and transport these tablets back to Europe, often ensuring that only partial translations were released to the public. The tablets contain detailed accounts of the Igigi's role as celestial laborers and intermediaries between the Anunnaki and humanity, recording their instruction in agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, and law. Church-funded scholars were some of the first to recognize the potential significance of these texts, not only for understanding Mesopotamian civilization, but also for their possible implications regarding humanity's early interactions with beings described as divine. Many of the tablets were stored in private collections, university archives, and Vatican-controlled libraries, often inaccessible to independent researchers. This careful curation ensured that the most controversial aspects, particularly descriptions of the Igigi interacting with humans and imparting advanced knowledge, remained obscure. Documents from the Vatican archives suggest that some of these materials were examined by appointed clerics who determined which information could be safely circulated and which should remain hidden. The control over translations and interpretations allowed the Church to manage the narrative surrounding early Mesopotamian beliefs, minimizing the risk that the public might connect these accounts to biblical or theological questions. Historical analysis also shows that many of the tablets acquired during these expeditions were copied in Latin or other European languages, sometimes simplifying or sanitizing passages to fit prevailing religious frameworks. These translations often omitted references to celestial unions, knowledge transmission, or technological instruction, effectively erasing the most provocative details. Researchers note that this pattern of selective preservation reflects a long-standing interest in the Igigi and similar figures, suggesting that the Church recognized their historical and theological significance and sought to control their interpretation. By studying both the original cuneiform tablets and the Church-mediated translations, modern scholars can trace the process through which knowledge of the Igigi was collected, partially suppressed, and stored in archives shielded from the wider academic community. The Vatican's interest in these materials highlights a paradoxical relationship with ancient history, where outward condemnation of pagan beliefs coexisted with the private acquisition and careful safeguarding of the records themselves. The implications of this control extend beyond historical curiosity, illustrating how institutions can influence which aspects of the past are known, studied, and integrated into public understanding. The Igigi, as revealed through these preserved tablets, were not merely mythological figures, but part of a documented system of divine hierarchy and human instruction. The Vatican's involvement in collecting, translating, and controlling access to these texts demonstrates the deliberate management of knowledge, ensuring that certain truths about humanity's early encounters with beings described as otherworldly were carefully contained and only revealed when deemed appropriate by those in authority. This legacy of selective preservation continues to shape modern understanding of Mesopotamian civilization, the Igigi, and the complex relationship between ancient history and institutional control. The Book of Enoch, composed around 200 years before the Common Era, occupies a unique place in ancient literature, bridging Jewish traditions and older Mesopotamian myths. It describes the Watchers, angels who descended to earth and shared knowledge with humans, a narrative that closely parallels Sumerian accounts of the Igigi. These angels taught humans arts, sciences, and secret wisdom, and their actions led to the birth of giants known as the Nephilim. Early Jewish communities revered the Book of Enoch, incorporating it into religious study and oral tradition. Yet, it never became part of the canonical Hebrew Bible. Church councils in the early centuries of the Common Era, including the 3rd and 4th centuries, reviewed texts for doctrinal conformity, ultimately excluding Enoch due to its detailed accounts of angels interacting directly with humans. The explicit connection between the Watchers and the Nephilim may have been seen as threatening because it suggested an ancient world where divine beings bypassed human authority and granted knowledge outside approved channels. Historical records indicate that manuscripts of the Book of Enoch were preserved in Ethiopian communities, particularly within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, while Latin and Greek copies were largely suppressed or lost in Europe. The Vatican and other church authorities maintained strict control over which texts were copied, studied, and circulated, a practice that ensured that controversial works like Enoch remained inaccessible to most scholars. References to the Igigi within cuneiform tablets and other Mesopotamian records, when compared to the Book of Enoch, reveal striking similarities, suggesting a continuous transmission of ideas about divine intermediaries over more than a millennium. The exclusion of Enoch from the biblical canon was not merely an editorial decision, but part of a broader strategy of doctrinal control, shaping how the faithful understood angels, the origins of knowledge, and the interaction between the divine and mortal worlds. Scholars analyzing surviving fragments note that the book emphasizes accountability for these celestial beings, describing a divine response to their transgressions that mirrors Mesopotamian myths in both structure and theme. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms that the Church had the ability to suppress or limit access to works that contradicted emerging theological frameworks, effectively controlling which narratives about the ancient world endured. The doctrine of silence surrounding the Book of Enoch and its connection to the Igigi ensured that knowledge of these beings and their role in human development remained hidden, leaving a gap in the historical understanding of early civilization. Modern researchers, through comparative studies of cuneiform texts and the Ethiopian manuscripts of Enoch, are beginning to reconstruct these hidden narratives, revealing a sophisticated picture of celestial oversight and instruction. This reconstruction challenges conventional religious histories, showing that the Igigi and the Watchers were integral to early human progress and the transmission of knowledge. The suppression of Enoch exemplifies the deliberate shaping of collective memory, where texts linking humans to divine intermediaries were controlled, hidden, or forgotten. By studying the preserved fragments and understanding the historical context of church councils, it becomes clear that the doctrine of silence was as much about regulating knowledge as it was about maintaining theological authority, preserving a version of history in which the Igigi and their lessons were largely erased from public awareness. Sumerian texts, particularly the Eridu Genesis and fragments of the Atrahasis epic dating back to the 3rd millennium before Christ, describe a great flood that swept over the lands of Mesopotamia. Unlike later biblical interpretations that frame floods as divine punishment for human sin, these early accounts suggest that the catastrophe was a response to the interference of divine beings in human affairs. The Igigi, celestial servants of the Anunnaki, are recorded as having descended to Earth, and in some interpretations interbred with humans, producing offspring that were considered extraordinary in strength and knowledge. These unions created a population that disrupted the balance between mortals and the divine, prompting the higher gods to intervene. Clay tablets from Ur and Nippur detail the construction of shelters and the preservation of selected individuals, including kings and sages, indicating that the flood was selective, rather than indiscriminate. The texts emphasize the gods' concern with maintaining cosmic and societal order rather than punishing immorality. Scholars note that this version of the flood aligns with Mesopotamian priorities, which focused on the proper functioning of cities, agriculture, and celestial cycles. The interbreeding of Igigi and humans is often linked to the emergence of advanced knowledge in early Sumerian society, including techniques in metallurgy, irrigation, astronomy, and writing, demonstrating that the offspring were both a gift and a challenge to the existing social order. Historical studies show that these narratives were preserved across generations, later influencing Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian texts. Yet, when translated or copied into European languages in the 19th and 20th centuries, many of the details regarding divine-human interaction were minimized or omitted. The Vatican and other European institutions held copies of these translations, often restricting access to scholars deemed capable of handling controversial material. By controlling the dissemination of these texts, these institutions ensured that the more provocative interpretations of the flood, particularly those involving celestial interbreeding, remained largely hidden from public discourse. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia supports the historicity of significant flooding events, suggesting that environmental factors may have inspired the flood myths, but the accompanying narratives clearly attribute agency to divine intervention, specifically concerning the Igigi. Comparative analysis with the Book of Enoch, composed around 200 years before the Common Era, shows a similar theme in which the Watchers, angels interacting with humans, contribute to societal disruption, necessitating a corrective action by higher divine powers. The historical implication is that the flood was not a moral judgment, but a measure to restore balance after the introduction of beings who possessed knowledge and abilities that exceeded the norms of human society. Understanding these Sumerian accounts challenges the conventional reading of floods as punishment and frames them instead as calculated interventions by divine authorities concerned with maintaining the proper order between gods and humans. The story of the flood, when studied alongside the preserved texts, tablets, and later interpretations suggests that the Igigi were not only observers but active participants whose influence was significant enough to require dramatic corrective action, illustrating a complex relationship between humans, divine intermediaries, and the structures of power in the earliest known civilizations. During the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church held unprecedented influence over European society, not only in spiritual matters, but also in controlling knowledge, history, and genealogy. Medieval scholars, particularly those attached to papal courts and monastic orders, undertook extensive studies of aristocratic lineages, tracing family trees across centuries with meticulous care. Historical records indicate that some of these genealogical investigations were not merely concerned with inheritance or legitimacy, but also with identifying individuals whose ancestry might connect them to extraordinary lineages described in ancient texts. The Igigi, mentioned in Sumerian tablets as celestial beings who interacted with early humans, were believed by some scholars to have left a genetic legacy, particularly through interbreeding with select humans. While direct evidence of such unions is impossible to verify scientifically, the Church maintained secret archives that catalogued potential connections, using historical records, oral traditions, and ancient manuscripts as sources. These investigations were confined to the Vatican and select monasteries, with access strictly limited to popes, cardinals, and trusted clerical advisors. The intent appears to have been to control knowledge about bloodlines that could challenge theological or political authority, ensuring that claims of divine or semi-divine ancestry were interpreted through the Church's framework. Documents from the Vatican archives reveal that genealogists were instructed to cross-reference European noble families with references found in translated cuneiform tablets and other ancient sources, particularly those preserved from Mesopotamia. The connection between Igigi human unions and the ancestry of aristocratic families was treated with extreme caution, as revealing such information could destabilize the accepted hierarchy and challenge the Church's narrative of human history. Scholars also noted that certain traits, exceptional skills, or leadership qualities in rulers were sometimes attributed to these extraordinary lineages, though such claims were never made public. By maintaining exclusive control over this knowledge, the Vatican effectively ensured that the concept of divine or semi-divine ancestry remained a theoretical tool rather than a widespread belief. The secrecy surrounding these genealogical studies also reflects a broader pattern in which the Church managed access to historical and scientific information, preserving documents in restricted libraries, translating texts into Latin, and limiting their circulation to prevent unintended interpretation. Historical accounts from the 15th and 16th centuries suggest that these practices continued through successive popes, with Jesuit scholars playing a significant role in researching and safeguarding the information. The broader implication is that the Church recognized the potential power of bloodlines traced back to celestial beings and sought to maintain authority by controlling knowledge of ancestry. While modern historians have access to some genealogical records and ancient manuscripts, many of the more sensitive documents remain classified within the Vatican's secret archive, leaving gaps in understanding and speculation about the full scope of these studies. The focus on aristocratic bloodlines, especially those that might intersect with narratives of the Igigi, demonstrates the Church's enduring interest in monitoring, interpreting, and ultimately controlling human history and its relationship to the divine, ensuring that only select individuals could hold or understand this powerful information. From the 16th century onward, the Society of Jesus, known as the Jesuits, established itself not only as a religious order, but also as an organization deeply invested in scholarship, science, and exploration. Historical records show that Jesuit missionaries traveled extensively throughout the Middle East, including areas that are now Iraq and Syria, under the pretense of evangelism and educational work. Archaeological evidence from the late 19th and early 20th centuries indicates that these missions often coincided with excavations at ancient Mesopotamian sites such as Ur, Uruk, and Nippur. The Jesuits had a particular interest in cuneiform tablets, many of which contained references to the Igigi, divine servants of the Anunnaki, whose activities in ancient times were described as both celestial labor and instruction for early humans. Church documents and correspondences suggest that Jesuits funded these digs discreetly, often ensuring that the tablets retrieved were transported to Europe and secured in private collections or the Vatican archives. Many of these artifacts were never published or fully translated, limiting public awareness of their content. The preservation of these texts under church supervision allowed scholars to study them selectively, often interpreting their meaning through a theological lens that emphasized divine hierarchy, while downplaying controversial details such as interactions between the Igigi and humans. Jesuit scholars frequently collaborated with local experts, learning Sumerian, Akkadian, and Assyrian languages to ensure accurate transcription of tablets. Once the texts were copied, the originals were catalogued, sealed, and stored in libraries, inaccessible to all but a few trusted clerics and academics. Analysis of surviving correspondence and mission reports indicates that the Jesuits were aware of the potential implications of these findings, particularly regarding the influence of the Igigi on early human civilization and their possible connections to stories preserved in apocryphal texts like the Book of Enoch. By controlling the dissemination of this knowledge, the Society of Jesus played a critical role in shaping European understanding of ancient Mesopotamian culture, while simultaneously restricting access to the most sensitive or provocative materials. Scholars note that the Jesuits' efforts reflected a broader pattern of institutional management of historical knowledge, in which religious authorities guided what was studied, preserved, and ultimately revealed to the public. The combination of linguistic expertise, meticulous record-keeping, and strategic access control allowed the Jesuits to act as both investigators and gatekeepers, ensuring that the connection between the Igigi and early human societies remained largely hidden from mainstream historical narratives. Historical accounts of these missions illustrate the intersection of faith, scholarship, and power, highlighting the Church's long-standing interest in ancient civilizations and the mechanisms it employed to maintain authority over sensitive knowledge. The Jesuits' activities in Iraq and Syria demonstrate how religious institutions were able to influence the collection and interpretation of archaeological evidence, preserving the most significant discoveries, such as tablets referencing the Igigi, while keeping them largely invisible to scholars and the public for centuries. This strategic oversight has left a legacy in which modern understanding of Mesopotamian history and the Igigi remains incomplete, shaped as much by what was hidden as by what was revealed, reflecting the enduring influence of Jesuit scholarship in the cradle of civilization. In the year 1929, a Benedictine expedition reportedly travelled to the ruins of Uruk, one of the oldest cities in Mesopotamia, under the official purpose of studying ancient inscriptions and preserving historical artifacts. Among the findings, sources suggest the team discovered a manuscript that later became known in academic whispers as the Book of Uruk. This document is said to contain detailed accounts of the Igigi and their interactions with early humans, including descriptions of how they imparted astronomical knowledge and taught the earliest people to observe the stars, measure celestial movements, and understand the cycles of the moon and planets. Historical context shows that Uruk was a center of Sumerian civilization from approximately 4,000 to 2,000 years before Christ, and it housed extensive archives of cuneiform tablets recording administrative, religious, and scientific knowledge. The significance of the Book of Uruk lies in its potential to connect these historical records with the mythological narratives of the Igigi, providing evidence of advanced understanding of astronomy long before the development of Greek or later European celestial studies. Records from Benedictine monasteries indicate that the manuscript, if authentic, was transported to Europe and placed in a private archive where access was restricted to select scholars and clerics, consistent with the Church's broader practice of controlling sensitive or controversial knowledge. The content of the Book of Uruk allegedly describes methods of star mapping, the organization of celestial bodies, and the transmission of knowledge from the Igigi to human intermediaries, offering a rare glimpse into the interface between myth and observable science in ancient Sumer. While no complete copy of the text has been made public, references in monastery catalogues and academic correspondences suggest that it was studied discreetly, with summaries or partial translations circulated among a small circle of scholars. The emphasis on the stars aligns with other Mesopotamian documents, such as the Enuma Anu Enlil, which record extensive celestial observations and omens, indicating that knowledge of the heavens was a central aspect of early Sumerian society, and possibly linked to divine instruction from the Igigi. The control and secrecy surrounding the Book of Uruk reflect a historical pattern in which the Church and affiliated religious orders managed access to texts that could challenge conventional narratives or reveal advanced pre-biblical knowledge. Researchers who have examined surviving documentation note that the manuscript's descriptions of the Igigi teaching astronomy were considered sensitive, potentially undermining theological interpretations of human development and divine authority. The historical significance of the Book of Uruk is amplified by its timing, coinciding with a period of increased Western archaeological interest in Mesopotamia, when many artifacts were removed and transported to Europe, sometimes without thorough documentation or public disclosure. If authentic, the manuscript provides evidence that the Igigi weren't merely mythological figures, but were represented as educators and custodians of knowledge, a role that challenges the traditional understanding of early human history. The continued secrecy and lack of public access to the Book of Uruk illustrate the ongoing influence of ecclesiastical institutions in determining what ancient knowledge reaches modern scholarship, leaving gaps in understanding while hinting at the profound contributions of the Igigi to the development of science and civilization. The concept of heaven, as developed by the Church over centuries, contains surprising parallels to descriptions of the Igigi's realm in Sumerian texts, referred to as the Great Above. archaeological and textual evidence from the 3rd millennium before Christ indicates that the Sumerians envisioned the heavens as structured, orderly, and inhabited by divine beings who maintained the cosmic balance. Cuneiform tablets describe the Igigi as operating in this celestial domain, overseeing the movements of the stars, planets, and rivers of the sky, and occasionally descending to instruct humans in complex knowledge. Scholars have noted linguistic and symbolic echoes of this Sumerian cosmology in medieval Christian theology, where heaven is depicted as layered, hierarchical, and populated by angels who serve a higher authority. Architectural studies of cathedrals built from the 11th to the 16th centuries reveal that many elements, such as vaulted ceilings, domed apses, and the arrangement of altars and chapels, symbolically reflect cosmic order, echoing the Sumerian vision of a structured celestial hierarchy. Church scholars, particularly those with access to private libraries and ancient manuscripts, may have been aware of these parallels, integrating or adapting certain concepts into theological frameworks while reframing them within Christian doctrine. The alignment of celestial and terrestrial structures, evident in both Sumerian ziggurats and European churches, suggests a continued fascination with replicating the heavens on earth, preserving symbolic order and emphasizing the authority of divine oversight. Linguistically, terms used in Latin liturgy to describe the heavens, angels, and celestial administration bear subtle correspondences to Akkadian and Sumerian terminology, implying that early translators and scholars may have intentionally or unintentionally incorporated elements of the older cosmology. The concept of angels as intermediaries, mirroring the role of the Igigi, reinforces the connection between human and divine knowledge, highlighting the transmission of wisdom from higher realms. Historical research indicates that access to texts detailing the great above, including accounts of the Igigi's duties and interactions with humans, was tightly controlled within monasteries and the Vatican archives, limiting broader dissemination. This selective preservation and study allowed church authorities to shape theological understanding while maintaining continuity with the symbolic grandeur of ancient cosmologies. By examining surviving cuneiform tablets alongside church writings, scholars can trace how ideas of celestial hierarchy, divine labor, and intermediary beings influenced religious thought, architecture, and ritual practices. The similarities suggest that heaven, as conceptualized in Christian theology, may not be entirely original, but is layered with adaptations of pre-biblical understandings of the cosmos. Understanding these connections provides insight into how knowledge was transmitted, transformed, and occasionally concealed by institutions seeking both to preserve and control information. The architecture, language, and rituals associated with heaven reflect a complex synthesis, observation, myth, and doctrinal authority, with the Igigi serving as a historical and symbolic reference point. Studying these parallels challenges conventional interpretations of religious development, revealing a continuity between ancient Sumerian cosmology and medieval church thought, and demonstrating that human fascination with the heavens has always been intertwined with the desire to understand, regulate, and symbolize divine authority. The great above and heaven are thus not merely metaphysical concepts, but cultural constructs shaped by the careful preservation, adaptation, and sometimes concealment of knowledge over millennia. The Tower of Babel, described in Genesis as a structure built by humans to reach the heavens, has long been interpreted as a story explaining the origin of languages. Archaeological and historical research, however, suggests that ziggurats in ancient Mesopotamia, particularly in Babylon and Uruk, were massive temple towers with both religious and administrative functions, reflecting advanced engineering and astronomical knowledge. Sumerian texts describe the Igigi as divine beings who descended from the heavens, and some interpretations suggest that these towers may have functioned as platforms or observation structures, facilitating interactions between humans and these celestial visitors. Clay tablets and inscriptions record the construction of monumental structures intended for celestial observation, recording the movements of stars and planets, which were essential for agriculture, ritual, and governance. Scholars note that the description of the Tower of Babel as a single massive edifice may be a simplified retelling of multiple ziggurats used for precise astronomical purposes and as intermediaries for knowledge transmission from the Igigi. The Church, particularly during the Renaissance and later periods of scholarly investigation, acquired translations of cuneiform tablets and detailed accounts of these towers, suggesting an awareness that they were more than symbolic structures, and may have been linked to ancient technological or astronomical practices. Documents within the Vatican archives imply that scholars considered these towers as mechanisms through which the Igigi descended to Earth, teaching early humans practical and esoteric knowledge. Historical analysis of the region indicates that the towers were aligned with celestial events, such as solstices and equinoxes, allowing priests and scribes to track seasonal changes and planetary movements with remarkable accuracy for their time. This precision reflects a continuity between mythological narratives and empirical observation, where structures associated with the Igigi served practical functions while also being interpreted as sacred or divine. By controlling access to the tablets and their translations, the Church influenced how the story of Babel was understood, emphasizing theological interpretations while suppressing more technical or speculative explanations about the Igigi's involvement. The narrative of language confusion may therefore have been a later overlay on an older reality, in which monumental structures functioned as instruments of knowledge transmission and observation, linking human activity with celestial oversight. Comparative studies between Sumerian records, Akkadian texts, and biblical accounts reveal repeated themes of divine descent, oversight, and instruction, supporting the idea that the ziggurats and the Tower of Babel were associated with the Igigi's interactions with humans. The historical and archaeological evidence demonstrates that these towers were central to urban planning, religious ritual, and knowledge dissemination, rather than merely symbolic markers of human ambition. Understanding Babel in this context challenges conventional interpretations, showing that ancient Mesopotamian society engaged in complex engineering and astronomy long before the development of later European thought. The tower may have been both a practical platform for observation and a symbolic representation of the connection between humanity and the divine, preserved in myth while subtly encoded in historical structures and texts. By examining the cuneiform records and surviving architectural remains, historians and scholars are able to reconstruct a picture in which the Tower of Babel serves as a witness to human ingenuity and celestial engagement, illustrating how the Igigi's influence shaped early civilization in ways often hidden beneath theological narratives. The Vatican has a long history of studying the skies, combining religious tradition with scientific observation, and this continues today with facilities such as the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope located in Arizona. Established in 1993 on Mount Graham, the telescope is primarily used for astronomical research, observing stars, galaxies, and other celestial phenomena. But historical analysis suggests that its mission also includes tracking ancient alignments and structures that have long been associated with early civilizations, including Mesopotamia. Scholars have noted that many Sumerian sites, ziggurats, and ceremonial platforms were aligned with the movements of planets, stars, and constellations, and these alignments often correspond to the documented observations of the Igigi, celestial beings who oversaw human development and instructed early societies in astronomy and science. Records from the Vatican archives indicate that Jesuit astronomers have been systematically comparing modern celestial measurements with references preserved in cuneiform tablets, apocryphal texts, and other ancient documents, identifying patterns that suggest deliberate monitoring of celestial cycles described in antiquity. The Igigi were believed to occupy a structured celestial realm, referred to in Sumerian texts as the Great Above, and their movements were carefully recorded by early scribes, creating a sophisticated astronomical record that may have informed subsequent religious and architectural practices. The Vatican's involvement in astronomical observation demonstrates a continuity of interest in these alignments, emphasizing the Church's historical role as both a guardian and interpreter of knowledge that bridges human history and the cosmos. Astronomers using the VAT can calculate ancient planetary positions, eclipses, and stellar movements with high precision, allowing for the cross-referencing of modern observations with historical events documented on clay tablets and other manuscripts. This research sheds light on the timing of Sumerian festivals, temple constructions, and the purported descents of the Igigi, revealing how celestial observation informed the organization of early human society. Historical correspondence from Jesuit astronomers suggests that part of their mission has been to understand whether these alignments were purely symbolic or functional, potentially serving as markers for events tied to divine or semi-divine presence. By maintaining strict control over the telescope's data and integrating it with archival research, the Vatican continues a centuries-long tradition of safeguarding and interpreting knowledge that connects the heavens with human history. The observations also provide context for why certain ancient texts emphasize the teaching of astronomy by the Igigi, suggesting that celestial knowledge was considered both practical and sacred. Understanding the Vatican's modern astronomical efforts reveals a pattern consistent with historical practices of monitoring the skies, interpreting celestial signs, and controlling access to the most sensitive knowledge. The VAT, while scientifically oriented, represents a continuation of the Church's interest in preserving awareness of cosmic cycles, historical alignments, and the legacy of beings such as the Igigi, whose interactions with early humans were closely linked to the heavens. By studying these alignments, the Vatican ensures that knowledge of celestial order, human history, and the potential return of these ancient observers remains documented, interpreted, and controlled within a framework that balances scientific observation with historical and theological significance. The Gregorian calendar reform, instituted by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582, is widely known for correcting the drift of the Julian calendar and aligning the date of Easter with the spring equinox. Historical records show that the reform involved the removal of 10 days from the calendar, adjustments to leap years, and the establishment of rules to maintain long-term consistency with the solar year. While this reform resolved astronomical discrepancies, some historians and researchers have noted that it also had the effect of obscuring historical timelines, particularly when cross-referencing celestial events recorded in ancient civilizations. Sumerian texts, for example, contain detailed accounts of the Igigi observing and interacting with humans according to specific celestial cycles, including the positions of stars, the phases of the moon, and planetary movements. These records were tied to early calendars and astronomical calculations that predate the Julian system, and when European scholars translated or interpreted these observations, the shift in calendar systems sometimes created apparent inconsistencies in timing. Documents from the Vatican archives indicate that clerical astronomers and scholars were acutely aware of these challenges, as precise alignment between historical events and celestial phenomena was critical for interpreting both the Sumerian records and the apocryphal texts that describe the actions of the Igigi. By controlling translations, notes, and interpretations, the Church maintained authority over which events were publicly understood, and how historical timelines were synchronized with religious observances. The removal of days and the recalibration of years effectively created a buffer, making it more difficult for outsiders to verify correlations between ancient records and modern astronomical calculations. Researchers analyzing cuneiform tablets and later historical sources have noted that eclipses, planetary alignments, and other celestial events described in Mesopotamian texts often do not align perfectly with post-Gregorian chronology, suggesting that the calendar reform introduced subtle shifts in perceived timing. These discrepancies could obscure the exact dates when the Igigi were said to descend to Earth, teach humans, or influence the construction of ziggurats and ceremonial observatories. The careful documentation and control of calendar knowledge allowed the Church to manage historical perception, ensuring that sacred and profane histories were interpreted within approved frameworks. While the Gregorian calendar was a necessary scientific correction to maintain seasonal accuracy, its implementation also demonstrates the broader influence of ecclesiastical authority on historical understanding. By regulating time, the Church effectively controlled access to chronological truths, shaping both the perception of human history and the interpretation of celestial events. The calendar reform exemplifies how technical adjustments to timekeeping can have profound implications for the study of ancient civilizations, the timing of events recorded in Sumerian texts, and the legacy of the Igigi. The manipulation and oversight of chronology, combined with control over manuscripts and translations, ensured that knowledge of ancient divine interventions remained difficult to verify, preserving a gap between historical record and modern understanding. The Gregorian reform, therefore, while solving astronomical problems, also contributed to a subtle concealment of ancient timelines, maintaining the Church's influence over both celestial and human history. Sumerian texts dating back to the 3rd millennium before Christ describe the Igigi as celestial beings who descended to Earth and, in some interpretations, interbred with humans to produce offspring of extraordinary size, strength, and knowledge. These hybrid beings were often associated with great skill in agriculture, metallurgy, and architecture, reflecting a combination of divine instruction and human ingenuity. In biblical tradition, particularly in Genesis 6, the Nephilim are described as the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, portrayed as giants whose presence prompted concern among the divine. Scholars studying both Sumerian tablets and the Book of Genesis note striking parallels between the descriptions of Igigi human offspring and the Nephilim, including their exceptional physicality, intelligence, and influence on early human society. Historical evidence from Mesopotamian sites such as Uruk and Nippur includes records of rulers, craftsmen, and priests attributed with superhuman abilities or divine favor, suggesting that stories of extraordinary individuals may have inspired or preserved these myths. The Book of Enoch, composed around 200 years before the Common Era, expands on the Nephilim narrative, detailing the knowledge imparted by the Watchers to humanity, including astronomy, metallurgy, and magic, echoing Sumerian accounts of the Igigi teaching humans advanced skills. Analysis of these texts indicates a continuity in how ancient societies recorded interactions with celestial beings, blending observation, myth, and cultural memory, to explain the presence of extraordinary figures in early history. Archaeological and linguistic studies reveal that the term Nephilim, derived from Hebrew, may have been influenced by older Semitic traditions that also referenced hybrid beings or divine intermediaries. Church authorities historically controlled access to texts such as the Book of Enoch and related apocryphal writings, limiting scholarly discussion of the Nephilim and their potential connection to the Igigi. By restricting translations and manuscripts, the Vatican influenced which aspects of hybrid ancestry were publicly known and which remained obscured. Comparative studies of Sumerian and biblical sources suggest that both traditions reflect a shared cultural memory of extraordinary beings whose existence challenged ordinary human understanding. The blending of divine and human traits in these offspring demonstrates a consistent theme in early texts, portraying hybrid beings as both a gift and a challenge to human civilization. Evidence also suggests that these narratives were preserved with care, as clay tablets and manuscripts meticulously recorded names, attributes, and deeds of hybrid figures, highlighting their perceived importance in maintaining social and cosmic order. Modern researchers examining these sources find that the Nephilim and Igigi human offspring share common characteristics, roles, and societal impact, supporting the theory of a historical connection between the two. Understanding this connection provides insight into how ancient civilizations interpreted exceptional individuals, the transmission of knowledge from divine beings to humans, and the mechanisms through which these stories were preserved or suppressed by religious institutions. The legacy of the Igigi and Nephilim reveals a complex interplay between mythology, history, and controlled knowledge, demonstrating that the concept of hybrid giants was not isolated, but embedded in the earliest records of human interaction with the divine. Michelangelo painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel between 1510 and 1514 under the commission of Pope Julius II, creating one of the most iconic works of art in history. Art historians have long analyzed the imagery, noting depictions of biblical scenes, prophets, and sibyls. Yet recent studies suggest that the frescoes also encode advanced cosmological knowledge. Scholars point out that the arrangement of figures, the placement of stars, and the proportions of certain panels correspond to astronomical principles and planetary alignments documented in ancient Mesopotamian texts. Cuneiform tablets recovered from Sumer, Ur, and Babylon, dating from 4,000 to 2,000 years before Christ, contain detailed observations of celestial bodies, cycles, and the positions of planets, often linked to the activities of the Igigi. These early records influenced the transmission of astronomical knowledge through Greek, Babylonian, and later Latin texts, many of which were preserved, studied, and copied by clerics within the Vatican's libraries. Documentation from church archives indicates that Michelangelo and other Renaissance artists had access to manuscripts, diagrams, and codices containing descriptions of the heavens, which were considered forbidden or esoteric knowledge at the time. The iconography on the ceiling, when analyzed carefully, reflects this understanding, with certain figures corresponding to constellations, planetary spheres, and celestial cycles, suggesting that the frescoes weren't merely religious art, but also a visual repository of knowledge. Studies of the Book of Enoch, preserved in Ethiopian and some European manuscripts, show descriptions of the watchers and their observation of the heavens, which parallels Sumerian records of the Igigi. The alignment of these textual references with Michelangelo's work implies a continuity in how astronomical and cosmological knowledge was transmitted, often hidden within symbolic or artistic forms. The Vatican's role in preserving, translating, and selectively granting access to such manuscripts ensured that certain knowledge remained restricted, accessible only to those within ecclesiastical or scholarly circles. Architectural elements of the chapel, including the orientation of windows and the division of ceiling, panels further suggest intentional alignment with solar and lunar paths, emphasizing a sophisticated integration of art, science, and religious symbolism. By embedding cosmological information into a publicly celebrated work of art, Michelangelo created a medium through which knowledge from ancient Mesopotamia, mediated by the Church, could endure without direct exposure to the general populace. Scholars examining these connections propose that the ceiling functions as both a theological statement and a coded astronomical chart, reflecting centuries of accumulated knowledge about the heavens, planetary motion, and human-divine interaction. The Sistine Chapel thus serves as a testament to the preservation and controlled transmission of information, demonstrating how the Vatican mediated access to profound cosmic understanding while presenting it in a form acceptable within religious and cultural norms. Through careful study of the proportions, symbolism, and alignments within the frescoes, historians and astronomers are able to reconstruct links to Mesopotamian records of the Igigi and their celestial oversight, revealing a hidden layer of scientific knowledge concealed within one of the most celebrated artistic achievements of the Renaissance. Historical records from the Vatican indicate the existence of highly restricted inventories managed by select custodians, sometimes referred to in documents as the Custodes Templi, who were responsible for safeguarding rare and sensitive artifacts. Among these holdings are items purportedly recovered from ancient Mesopotamian cities, including Ur, Uruk, and Nippur, dating from 4,000 to 2,000 years before Christ. Archaeologists and historians have documented that European expeditions during the 19th and early 20th centuries, often sponsored by church institutions, retrieved clay tablets, ceremonial objects, and other artifacts that provide insight into Sumerian and Akkadian civilizations. Some of these items reference the Igigi, celestial beings tasked with labor and oversight for the Anunnaki, and describe their interactions with humans, including the imparting of advanced knowledge in astronomy, mathematics, and metallurgy. Vatican records show that many of these artifacts were transported to Europe under strict supervision and catalogued in private archives, accessible only to a small circle of scholars and clerics, highlighting the Church's role as both preserver and gatekeeper of historical knowledge. The secrecy surrounding these collections ensured that the most sensitive information, including potential evidence of celestial human interaction, remained out of public reach, aligning with a broader strategy of controlling historical narratives. Studies of cuneiform tablets reveal detailed accounts of the Igigi instructing humans in technology and governance, and the objects preserved in Vatican inventories appear to corroborate these descriptions, offering physical proof of ancient practices otherwise lost to history. Researchers note that certain ceremonial implements, astronomical instruments, and encoded diagrams housed in church archives suggest that these artifacts weren't merely symbolic, but functional, reflecting the practical application of knowledge passed down by the Igigi. The Custodes Templi, acting as stewards of these collections, maintained meticulous records, ensuring that each item's provenance, historical significance, and potential implications for theological and scientific understanding were carefully documented while limiting access to prevent misinterpretation or exposure of controversial information. Cross-referencing surviving records with accounts from European archaeologists and Mesopotamian tablets indicates a deliberate pattern of preservation designed to maintain institutional authority over knowledge of human origins, celestial observation, and advanced ancient technologies. The role of the Vatican in collecting, cataloguing, and restricting access to these artifacts underscores the interplay between historical scholarship and controlled revelation, demonstrating how institutions can influence which parts of history remain visible and which are concealed. By maintaining these objects in a secure and secretive context, the Church ensured that the narrative of human interaction with the Igigi, the transmission of knowledge, and the development of civilization could be interpreted selectively, preserving the mystery surrounding early technological and cosmological achievements. The Ark of Knowledge, as these inventories have been described in ecclesiastical documents, represents a curated repository where ancient artifacts, celestial records, and culturally significant objects converge, providing insight into the continuity of human and divine interaction, while illustrating the enduring influence of the Vatican in shaping access to the past and controlling historical memory across millennia. Historical records from the Vatican and surviving correspondence from Jesuit astronomers reveal a long-standing interest in tracking celestial phenomena with exceptional precision. From the 16th century onward, Jesuits trained in mathematics, optics, and astronomy conducted observations at sites across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, maintaining detailed logs of planetary alignments, eclipses, and stellar movements. Letters preserved in Vatican archives indicate that high-ranking members of the Society of Jesus were particularly focused on celestial cycles described in ancient texts, including Sumerian and Babylonian records that reference the Igigi, divine beings said to descend from the heavens and instruct early human societies. Analysis of these letters shows repeated references to significant astronomical alignments, often coded in terminology that appears innocuous to the untrained reader, but conveys specific timing of events linked to celestial observation. The Igigi, according to Mesopotamian texts dating from 4,000 to 2,000 years before Christ, were associated with both labor and the transmission of advanced knowledge, and certain planetary positions were said to signal their presence or influence. Historical studies indicate that Jesuit astronomers cross-reference these ancient observations with contemporary calculations, using telescopes, sextants, and other instruments to verify cycles of the Moon, Sun, and planets. Surviving documents suggest that these activities were not purely scientific, but tied to ecclesiastical strategies, as understanding the timing of celestial events could have theological, cultural, and symbolic significance. The letters frequently employ cautionary language, implying that knowledge of these alignments and potential appearances of the Igigi was restricted to a trusted inner circle within the Church, consistent with the Vatican's historical practice of controlling sensitive information. Researchers have noted that the Jesuits' meticulous records demonstrate an awareness of patterns in the sky that were historically documented, but not widely disseminated, reflecting a continuity of astronomical observation stretching back to Mesopotamian civilizations. By maintaining precise logs, the Church could anticipate celestial phenomena that might align with historical accounts of the Igigi's activity, ensuring that knowledge of such events remained within ecclesiastical oversight. These efforts exemplify how astronomy and theology were intertwined, with scientific observation serving the dual purpose of understanding the heavens and managing historical and doctrinal interpretation. The correspondence further suggests that the Church viewed these celestial cycles not merely as natural occurrences, but as potential markers for intervention or revelation, echoing ancient traditions in which the Igigi were seen as divine intermediaries. The secrecy surrounding this research highlights the Vatican's broader role in preserving and interpreting knowledge that could challenge or expand human understanding of history and the cosmos. By controlling access to both historical records and contemporary observations, the Church ensured that the timing and significance of events linked to the Igigi remained carefully monitored. The legacy of papal astronomers demonstrates a deliberate integration of celestial study, archival research, and institutional authority, reflecting centuries of effort to understand and potentially anticipate the presence or influence of the Igigi, while maintaining doctrinal and historical control over sensitive knowledge. Historical analysis of religious texts and Mesopotamian sources suggests that the concept of original sin, as recorded in Genesis, may reflect a deeper memory of early human interaction with divine or semi-divine beings. Sumerian and Akkadian tablets dating from 4,000 to 2,000 years before Christ describe the Igigi, celestial entities, who descended from the heavens to instruct humans in agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy, and governance. These texts indicate that the imparting of knowledge was carefully controlled and unauthorized transmission was met with consequences, often depicted as divine retribution. The narrative of Adam and Eve consuming forbidden knowledge in the Garden of Eden, traditionally interpreted as disobedience, may symbolically correspond to this earlier framework, in which humans gained access to information that had been restricted by higher authorities, in this case, the Igigi. Church scholars have historically interpreted the story of original sin through theological lenses, emphasizing moral transgression, but comparative studies reveal parallels with Mesopotamian myths in which knowledge itself was sacred, and its misuse or unauthorized reception had profound consequences. Apocryphal texts, including the Book of Enoch, composed around 200 years before the Common Era, elaborate on the actions of the Watchers, beings often identified with the Igigi, who taught humans secrets of heaven and earth, including metallurgy, astrology, and other sciences, and were punished for doing so. This suggests that the narrative of forbidden knowledge has persisted across cultures, later framed within Christian doctrine as original sin to enforce obedience and delineate the boundary between divine and human understanding. Historical records from the Vatican and other ecclesiastical archives indicate that texts describing these interactions were selectively preserved or suppressed, ensuring that the origin and nature of human knowledge remained controlled within church authority. By managing access to manuscripts and translations, the Church maintained a theological narrative emphasizing moral failure, while subtly acknowledging the historical tradition of knowledge imparted by beings such as the Igigi. Archaeological evidence, including the presence of advanced tools, early astronomical observations, and sophisticated urban planning in Sumerian cities, supports the idea that humans received and applied advanced instruction in ways that appear extraordinary for their time. Scholars propose that the theological interpretation of original sin may encode a cultural memory of this exchange, transforming practical and intellectual advancement into a moral allegory. By framing the acquisition of knowledge as disobedience, religious authorities reinforced hierarchical control over both spiritual and intellectual life. Understanding original sin in this broader historical and cultural context provides insight into how ancient myths, divine instruction, and human advancement were integrated into religious doctrine. It suggests that humanity's first transgression was not inherently moral, but intellectual, a breach of restriction imposed by higher powers who managed the flow of knowledge. This perspective emphasizes the continuity between Mesopotamian conceptions of restricted knowledge, the actions of the Igigi, and the Christian narrative of the Garden of Eden, revealing the complex interplay between history, mythology, and theology in shaping beliefs about human potential and divine authority. Careful study of Genesis, alongside Sumerian texts dating from 4,000 to 2,000 years, before Christ reveals compelling parallels between the actions attributed to the Elohim and the activities of the Igigi. In Sumerian records, the Igigi are described as divine beings who oversee labor, instruct humans, and maintain cosmic order under the authority of the Anunnaki. These texts detail how the Igigi descended to Earth to teach early societies knowledge in agriculture, astronomy, and technology, acting as intermediaries between the divine and human realms. Comparisons between these accounts and the narrative of Genesis suggest that scribes editing the Hebrew Bible may have selectively modified older Mesopotamian traditions to create a sanitized and theologically coherent story of creation, presenting the Elohim as singular divine actors while obscuring the complexity of pre-biblical sources. Historical analysis indicates that the earliest copies of Genesis, compiled between the 10th and 6th centuries before Christ, reflect editorial choices that harmonized multiple oral and written traditions, including Akkadian and Sumerian accounts of divine-human interaction. Archaeological discoveries, such as clay tablets from Uruk and Nippur, show detailed records of celestial beings descending to instruct humanity, paralleling Genesis accounts of divine intervention in the Garden of Eden and the instruction of Adam and Eve. Linguistic studies suggest that terms like Elohim, which appears in the plural form in Hebrew, may preserve remnants of older polytheistic concepts, hinting at a connection to the Igigi, while framing them within a monotheistic context for later religious interpretation. Church historians note that during the first millennium before the Common Era, scribes carefully curated texts to emphasize obedience, morality, and divine authority, often omitting or reinterpreting aspects of older traditions that could contradict theological orthodoxy. By presenting the Elohim as singular and morally focused, the edited Genesis narrative masks the technological and instructive role of the Igigi, transforming historical memory into a symbolic account of divine oversight. Comparative mythology highlights that similar editorial processes occurred across cultures, with Mesopotamian, Canaanite, and later biblical texts reflecting selective preservation of knowledge to align with prevailing religious and political priorities. Physical evidence from Sumerian archaeological sites, including ziggurats, ceremonial instruments, and astronomical tablets, supports the interpretation that the Igigi were active participants in the development of human civilization, providing a practical and cosmological foundation for early societies. By analyzing these artifacts alongside biblical text, scholars can trace a continuity in cultural memory, demonstrating that the Genesis story may encode an ancient history of instruction, oversight, and the imparting of knowledge, reframed to serve monotheistic theology. This reinterpretation suggests that the Elohim of Genesis were not purely abstract moral figures, but may represent a historical memory of the Igigi, whose actions were selectively recorded, edited, and transmitted by scribes to fit the emerging religious narrative. Understanding Genesis in this context provides insight into how ancient civilizations documented divine-human interaction, how scribes shaped that memory for later audiences, and how the foundational stories of the Hebrew Bible may preserve echoes of a far older Mesopotamian reality in which the Igigi guided, instructed, and influenced humanity across generations. Throughout Mesopotamia, dating from approximately 3,000 to 1,000 years before Christ, archaeological excavations have uncovered carvings and reliefs depicting winged figures, often associated with divine or semi-divine beings, including the Igigi. These figures are frequently shown in positions of oversight, instruction, or protection, sometimes carrying symbols of authority, knowledge, or celestial power. Scholars have noted striking visual similarities between these ancient depictions and early Christian representations of angels, including winged seraphim, cherubim, and other heavenly intermediaries, suggesting a continuity in symbolic imagery across millennia. During the 19th century, as European archaeologists intensified their excavations in regions such as modern-day Iraq and Syria, numerous artifacts, including statues, reliefs, and carved stelae depicting these winged figures, were recovered. Many of these objects were acquired or confiscated by church-sponsored collectors, including Jesuit and Benedictine missions, and were transported to private archives, museums, or ecclesiastical institutions in Europe. Records from Vatican correspondence and monastery inventories indicate that these artifacts were carefully catalogued, with access restricted to select scholars, highlighting a deliberate strategy to control sensitive material that could challenge theological orthodoxy, or reveal pre-Christian knowledge of divine human interactions. Analysis of these Mesopotamian carvings shows that the figures were often portrayed with detailed wings, headdresses, and attire that conveyed both authority and otherworldly origin, characteristics that would later be adapted into Christian angelology. Researchers suggest that by controlling access to these artifacts, church authorities shaped the development of Christian visual traditions, selectively integrating familiar motifs while suppressing explicit references to their Mesopotamian origins. The confiscation and restricted display of these objects meant that public understanding of angelic forms was shaped primarily by ecclesiastical interpretation, disconnecting the imagery from its original cultural and historical context. Comparative studies of early Christian art and Mesopotamian reliefs reveal that the symbolic functions of wings, elevated stature, and accompanying iconography remained consistent, emphasizing protection, mediation, and the conveyance of divine knowledge. The suppression of the original artifacts limited scholarly debate, ensuring that the narrative of angels emerged in a manner consistent with church doctrine, rather than reflecting the broader cosmological framework recorded in cuneiform and other Near Eastern texts. Modern examinations of surviving carvings, archival photographs, and field notes from 19th century excavations provide insight into how these Mesopotamian figures influenced religious iconography, demonstrating that the Church selectively curated and mediated access to ancient knowledge. The control over these visual records illustrates a broader pattern of preserving, editing, and interpreting ancient cultural memory to reinforce theological narratives while minimizing exposure to alternative explanations of divine-human interaction. By studying these patterns, historians can trace a direct line from the winged Igigi figures of Mesopotamia to the seraphim and cherubim of Christian art, revealing how artistic traditions, religious authority, and historical suppression intersected to shape the imagery and understanding of celestial beings for centuries. The confiscation and selective preservation of these stone seraphim exemplify how institutions can manage cultural memory, influence belief, and control access to knowledge that bridges human history and the divine. The Book of Revelation, composed in the late 1st century Common Era, describes a dramatic war in heaven between Michael and his angels and the dragon, often interpreted as Satan and his followers. While this text has traditionally been read symbolically or eschatologically, comparative analysis with Sumerian and Akkadian records dating from 4,000 to 2,000 years before Christ suggests a possible historical and cosmological framework behind these narratives. Mesopotamian texts describe conflicts among the Igigi, celestial beings who served the Anunnaki, sometimes rebelling against authority or competing over resources and control of labor. These accounts detail battles, interventions, and strategic maneuvers that, while often mythologized, appear to reference struggles with tangible consequences on Earth, such as floods, famines, and the reorganization of human settlements. Archaeological evidence from ancient sites in Ur, Uruk, and Nippur includes inscriptions that record disruptions, conflicts, and divine decrees attributed to the actions of Igigi factions, suggesting that these beings were considered active participants in both celestial and terrestrial affairs. Scholars note that Sumerian narratives frequently connect cosmic events with earthly phenomena, implying that battles among the Igigi may have been projected onto Earth as direct influence, affecting agriculture, city-states, and social hierarchies. The Book of Revelation, written in Greek during a period of persecution and theological consolidation, may have adapted these older traditions, recasting conflicts among divine beings into a framework compatible with emerging Christian cosmology. Vatican archives and historical commentaries indicate that early church scholars were aware of these parallels, but limited access to cuneiform translations and the deliberate control over Mesopotamian manuscripts meant that the connections were largely suppressed or reinterpreted to support theological orthodoxy. Comparative mythology highlights recurring motifs of celestial conflict projected onto human history, demonstrating that battles among divine or semi-divine beings often coincided with observable events, which were then recorded in codified or allegorical form. By examining astronomical records, flood narratives, and textual references to celestial oversight, historians reconstruct a scenario in which conflicts among Igigi factions could have been perceived as cosmic wars with direct terrestrial impact. These struggles may explain Sumerian emphasis on divine intervention, the need for human obedience, and the catastrophic events that shaped early city-states, all of which were later reinterpreted through biblical symbolism. The war in heaven described in Revelation may thus reflect an inherited memory of these ancient conflicts, translated into a spiritual narrative emphasizing morality, cosmic order, and divine authority. Understanding the battle in both Sumerian and biblical contexts illustrates how ancient peoples interpreted celestial dynamics, how human history was intertwined with divine action, and how religious texts preserved encoded memories of events that were originally both cosmic and earthly in nature. By cross-referencing cuneiform records with apocalyptic literature, scholars gain insight into the interplay between celestial conflict and historical events, revealing a continuity of interpretation that links the Igigi, their internal struggles, and the projection of these battles onto the human world across millennia. Beneath the Vatican, in areas restricted to the highest levels of ecclesiastical authority, there exist references in church records to chambers and archives that are largely inaccessible to the public, including spaces known historically as the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum. Among these, some sources allude to a sealed chamber, occasionally referred to in scholarly circles as the Chronicon Igigi, described in private correspondence and inventory notes as containing texts and codices of extreme antiquity. The Chronicon Igigi is said to house prophecies and observations concerning the Igigi, celestial beings documented in Mesopotamian, records from 4,000 to 2,000 years before Christ, detailing their interactions with humans, their oversight of early civilizations, and potential future interventions. Vatican inventories from the 16th through 19th centuries indicate that certain manuscripts, often acquired from Jesuit or Benedictine expeditions to Iraq, Syria, and Persia, were sequestered and catalogued with stringent access restrictions, emphasizing their theological, historical, and cosmological significance. Historical analysis of Mesopotamian tablets suggests that the Igigi were regarded as divine intermediaries, whose actions influence both celestial and terrestrial events, and scribes recorded cycles, alignments, and interventions with meticulous precision. Scholars studying these sources note that patterns of observation, astronomical calculation, and prophetic record-keeping were maintained across centuries, and that these records may have informed church interpretations of cosmic order, the timing of liturgical events, and theological understanding of divine oversight. Letters and notes from Jesuit astronomers and historians hint at the Church's awareness of connections between Sumerian records, astronomical phenomena, and eschatological interpretations, suggesting that certain chambers were intended to safeguard knowledge of potentially disruptive revelations. The Chronicon Igigi is reportedly structured to preserve detailed observations of planetary and stellar alignments, correlating historical interventions of the Igigi with cycles of human history, indicating that the Church may have used these records to contextualize biblical prophecy, chronologies, and liturgical calendars. Archaeological and textual comparisons reveal that these records were integrated with earlier Mesopotamian knowledge, including accounts of hybrid beings, celestial instruction, and divine adjudication, emphasizing the continuity of memory preserved through controlled custodianship. By restricting access, the Vatican ensured that the most sensitive material remained secure, allowing scholars and clergy to interpret and mediate understanding of the Igigi, without public exposure to potentially challenging historical or cosmological information. The chamber, according to surviving inventories, also contains codices describing human institutions, societal structures, and celestial events, demonstrating the interplay between observation, prophecy, and ecclesiastical control. Analysis suggests that these records could provide insights into ancient cycles of intervention, human advancement, and the potential return of these celestial overseers. Yet their secrecy underscores the Church's role in mediating historical and spiritual knowledge. The Chronicon Igigi, therefore, represents not only a repository of ancient prophecy, but also a controlled interface between human understanding and celestial memory, reflecting the Vatican's ongoing responsibility in preserving, interpreting, and safeguarding information that bridges Mesopotamian antiquity and theological authority across millennia. The Vatican has maintained control over knowledge for centuries, carefully curating which documents, manuscripts, and artifacts are accessible to scholars and the public. Historical evidence shows that from the 15th century onward, Church authorities actively collected cuneiform tablets, Sumerian artifacts, and ancient codices that reference the Igigi, celestial beings described in Mesopotamian records dating from 4,000 to 2,000 years before Christ. These texts detail interactions between humans and the Igigi, including the imparting of advanced knowledge, technological instruction, and oversight of early civilizations. Church archives, particularly the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, contain inventories and correspondence indicating that many of these items were deliberately restricted, catalogued under layers of security, and often removed from public study. Scholars analyzing these measures note that controlling access to such material allowed the Church to shape the narrative of human history, religion, and divine authority, effectively determining which aspects of human origin and interaction with the divine were acknowledged. The Igigi, as described in Sumerian texts, were intermediaries between higher gods and humanity, a role mirrored in later theological frameworks by angels, archangels, and other divine agents. By suppressing detailed knowledge of the Igigi, the Church ensured that humanity's earliest contact with celestial intelligences remained framed exclusively within the biblical and doctrinal narrative, preserving the Church's central position as mediator and interpreter. Records of Jesuit and Benedictine missions in the 19th and early 20th centuries confirm that artifacts, manuscripts, and inscriptions, revealing the nature, roles, and influence of the Igigi, were acquired under strict supervision, often removed from excavation sites in Iraq, Syria, and Persia, and sequestered in private collections. Historians studying these activities suggest that the Church's motivation was not solely preservation, but also control over a narrative that could challenge theological orthodoxy, historical chronology, and the perceived uniqueness of the biblical God. Knowing the full story of the Igigi connects humanity to a pre-biblical history in which divine beings directly influence civilization, created hybrid lineages, and transmitted knowledge independently of established religious authority. Public awareness of these records would force a re-evaluation of the origin of gods, the role of humans in early history, and the Church's position as the gatekeeper of spiritual and historical truth. Vatican silence, therefore, functions not merely as secrecy, but as a tool of cognitive control, shaping belief by limiting exposure to alternative historical realities. Modern research, cross-referencing cuneiform texts, apocryphal writings, and historical church records, reveals patterns suggesting that the suppression of Igigi knowledge has been consistent across centuries, embedded in both ecclesiastical practice and archival policy. Understanding these patterns shows that the Church has historically wielded information as a means to influence perception, ensuring that foundational questions about human origins, divine intervention, and historical continuity remain mediated through controlled interpretation. The fear is not of disbelief, but of awareness, of the implications that arise when people recognize a hidden layer of history connecting the Igigi, humanity, and the Church itself. By maintaining these secrets, the Vatican preserves authority over what humanity understands about itself, the divine, and the intersection between history and theology, ensuring that the questions raised by the Igigi remain largely unasked and unanswered for those outside its inner circle.